Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, if you enjoy this kind of quiet, reflective storytelling, do take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A slow, meandering walk through the quiet corridors of Austrian history. Not the Austria of postcards or ski resorts, but the older, deeper Austria. The land of monks and margins, of misty valleys and slow-moving empires. The Austria that drifts between memory and myth. Tucked into the heart of Europe, Austria is a land of enclosed valleys and winding rivers. A place where time has always seemed to move a little more slowly. Even the mountains appear to rest, not rise, wrapped as they are in layers of snow and silence. It is a country shaped not by the drama of conquest, so much as by the long weight of continuity, of empires sustained rather than expanded, of borders drawn more by treaties than by battles. Its history is not without conflict, but those conflicts often came from elsewhere, as if Austria, by its very geography, became a kind of corridor through which others passed, lingered, and sometimes stayed. Over the centuries, Austria has been many things. A Roman frontier, a margraviate, a duchy, and later the centerpiece of one of Europe's most enduring dynasties. But it has also been a collection of quiet villages and cloistered abbeys, a patchwork of dialects and loyalties, a place where the rhythms of rural life persisted even as emperors ruled from glittering halls in Vienna. It is this contrast between grandeur and quietude that perhaps best defines Austrian history, a slow burn rather than a blaze. Tonight, as we begin our journey, we won't rush. We'll start not with kings or conquests, but in the soft murk of prehistory, in the caves and meadows where early humans once wandered, where the land itself began to take on the shape we know today. From there, gently and gradually, we'll follow the winding thread of Austria's past, always mindful of its quiet cadences, its gentle pace. And perhaps, as we go, you'll find your own breath slowing, your own thoughts softening, and your body growing just a little heavier with each passing minute. So if you're ready, let's begin. Let us begin, if you will, in a time before Austria was a name, or even a notion. A time long before written memory, when the land now known as Austria was shaped not by the plans of men, but by the slow processes of nature. The Alps themselves had already risen, though even they, for all their seeming permanence, were still changing, their peaks worn by wind and time, their valleys deepening with the slow work of ice and water. In these ancient wooded expanses, small groups of humans began to appear, not all at once, and never in great number, but gradually, like dew settling on the grass. The earliest evidence we have of these first Austrians, if we may use that word so generously, comes from the misted reaches of the Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years ago, where in what is now Lower Austria, the famous Venus of Willendorf was shaped by hand, a tiny limestone figure just over 4 inches tall, carved with gentle curves and generous form. She has no face, only suggestion, but she carries with her the weight of ages, a quiet symbol of fertility or perhaps hope. She was found in 1908, but she belonged to a world that had long vanished even then. These first people lived simply, we believe, hunting and gathering, following the rhythms of the seasons. Their tools were made of flint and bone. Their homes, if they had them, were likely temporary. the caves offering shelter from cold winds, their fires flickering against stone walls now silent. We know little of their names or language, nothing in fact, but we know they were there by the things they left behind. A worked blade here, a hearthstone there, the barest whispers of a life once lived. As the Ice Age receded, so too did the great glaciers, and in their place came forests, and animals, and more people. During the Neolithic period, from around 5000 BCE, small settlements began to appear. Farming arrived, not suddenly, but gradually, like a new habit forming. People began to stay put, to plant grain, to raise animals. They learned to fire pottery and to shape wood and stone with greater care. The land, once merely a place to pass through, began to hold meaning. Borders of sorts began to form, not political but personal. This stream, that grove, this patch of tilled earth, they were starting to belong. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of these early farmers across Austria. The region around Lake Mondsee, for instance, reveals signs of a stilt house culture, homes built above water, linked by walkways, secure from animals and floods. There's something haunting about that image. Wooden homes, swaying gently over a still lake, children playing along the planks, smoke curling from low fires, the hum of insects and the scent of damp wood in the air. We can only imagine the quiet routines of their days, so different from ours, yet somehow familiar in the rhythm of daily tasks. By the Bronze Age, around 1800 BCE, the land had grown more connected. Trade began to stretch across longer distances. Copper from the mountains, tin from afar, combined to make bronze tools and ornaments. In the hills near Hallstatt, salt was mined, not with modern machines, but with wooden picks and great patience. Hallstatt would become a name of significance, its culture lending its name to an entire period of early European history. The Hallstatt culture, which flourished from roughly 800 to 500 BCE, was marked by skilled metalwork, elaborate burials, and a growing sense of social organization. Salt, they say, was white gold in those days, prized not just for taste, but for preservation. It allowed food to be kept through the long winters, to be traded far and wide. The salt mines at Hallstatt, carved into the heart of the mountains, were worked by generations of labourers, some of whom left behind not stories but tools. Their picks, their clothing, even their droppings preserved in the cool, dry earth. It is in these accidental preservations that we glimpse their world, not as a grand narrative, but as a slow accumulation of lives lived quietly, one after another. And still the land changed. By the Iron Age, the Celts had arrived, not as an army, but as a culture spreading gradually across Central Europe. They brought new customs, new languages, new ways of working metal. In what is now Austria, they built oppida, hill forts that served as centres of trade, worship, and governance. Some of these sites, like the one at Magdalensburg, would later be taken over by the Romans, but for a time they stood as quiet testaments to Celtic life, fields enclosed by timber palisades, smoke curling from hearths, the slow beating of hammers against iron. The Celts of this region are often associated with the Kingdom of Noricum, a name the Romans would later recognize. It wasn't a kingdom in the strict sense, more a confederation of tribes bound loosely by shared culture and trade, but it had structure and roads and metallurgy of high skill. When the Romans came, They admired the ironwork of Noricum so much they brought it into their empire, not through conquest, but through incorporation. It is a rare and quiet kind of transition, and one that suits Austria's gentle historical rhythm. And so we arrive, softly, at the threshold of recorded history. From the shadows of the Stone Age, through the flickering firelight of the Bronze Age, into the smoky forges of the Iron Age. Austria, though not yet by name, has already taken form. A land shaped by its geography, its mountains, rivers, and mineral wealth, but more deeply by its people. Not great rulers or famous battles, but the slow accumulation of ordinary lives, farming, forging, gathering salt, raising families, mending tools, watching the weather. Such is the quiet origin of a country that would one day become an empire. By the time the Romans began to extend their gaze northward across the rolling hills and thick forests that lay beyond the Alps, the region we now call Austria was no longer an anonymous patch of land. It had names, and those names carried weight. Foremost among them was Noricum. Not a city, not quite a nation, but rather a loosely bound realm of Celtic tribes. Its heart lay in the central uplands, around present-day Carinthia and Styria, a land of wooded valleys, iron-rich mountains, and settlements perched quietly on defensible hillsides. Noricum was not born of ambition, but of geography and necessity. It had no single ruler, no capital as we might expect. Instead, it was a network of communities, speaking related tongues, trading shared goods. Iron was their principal treasure, dug from the earth with care, smelted with knowledge passed down over generations. Noric steel, as it came to be known, was prized for its quality, tough, flexible, dependable. The Roman army would come to value it highly. In a world before mass production, the reputation of such craftsmanship travelled far. It is tempting to imagine Noricum as a sleepy, remote corner of the Celtic world, and in some respects that would not be wrong. There were no great armies here, no epic conflicts, but it was not isolated. Trade routes passed through the region, connecting it to the Adriatic and to Gaul, to the Danube and the Alps. Amber, salt, livestock, wine, pottery, all passed through Noricum. The people lived in modest hill forts and open settlements, their homes made of timber and clay, their lives governed by the rhythms of sun and season. It was a land of slow work and long winters, but also of quiet exchange. The Romans, ever watchful, recognized the value of this place, not just its iron, but its position. Noricum sat at the edge of the Roman world, a threshold between the orderly provinces and the wilder Germanic lands beyond. For a time, it remained independent, yet firmly within Rome's economic orbit. And then quietly it became a province, not through war, but through diplomacy. Around 15 BCE, during the reign of Augustus, Noricum was formally annexed. The transition was smooth, perhaps even welcomed by the local elite, who gained Roman citizenship, protection, and access to broader markets. Under Roman rule, Noricum changed, but not all at once. The Latin language appeared, Roman law was introduced, and with it a more structured administration. Cities were founded, or rather, existing settlements were reshaped into Roman forms. Virunum, Turnia, Ovilava, each with its forum, its bathhouse, its modest theatre. None were grand, not by Roman standards, but they brought a new kind of order. Roads were laid out, straight and purposeful, linking one outpost to the next. The famous Via Claudia would eventually run from the Adriatic to the Danube, passing through Noricum like a thread through cloth. The Roman military presence was light at first, more a watchful eye than a heavy hand. Along the Danube, however, the situation was different. There, the river marked the frontier, the limes, beyond which lay the Germanic tribes, and so Rome built forts, Carnuntum, Vindobona, Lauriacum. These names would echo through time. Carnuntum in particular became a major military hub, a legionary base, a civilian town, a seat of governance. At its height, it may have housed over 50,000 people, traders, soldiers, artisans, administrators, a small city full of life, positioned at the edge of empire. Vindobona, of course, would become something more, the site of modern-day Vienna, though in the Roman era it was but a modest fort on the Danube's banks, quiet, functional, a place of garrisoned routine. The soldiers stationed there came from all over the empire, Spain, Syria, North Africa, and they brought with them customs, foods, even gods. In time, the local population blended with these newcomers, intermarrying, adopting Latin names, learning to read and write. A kind of Roman-Austrian identity began to form, not uniform, but recognizably distinct. Life in Roman Noricum was not glamorous, but it was steady. The towns grew slowly. Agriculture thrived in the valleys. Villas were built, often with mosaic floors and hypocaust heating. Temples stood beside shrines to local deities. Bathhouses offered warmth and conversation. There were taxes, of course, and laws to follow. But for many, Roman rule brought a sense of stability, the kind that allows a person to plan for next year, not just tomorrow. And yet the empire was not immune to time's slow erosion. By the 3rd century, the frontiers began to grow restless. Germanic incursions increased. The Danube, once a secure border, became a line of tension. Carnuntum was sacked more than once. Vindobona suffered as well. And yet life went on. The towns were rebuilt, the walls reinforced. In the face of uncertainty, the people turned inward. Communities became more self-reliant, less Roman in appearance, but still deeply shaped by that long inheritance. By the early 4th century, Christianity had begun to spread, first cautiously, then more openly. The old gods, once worshipped in stone temples and roadside altars, began to fade. Bishops appeared in places like Turnia, guiding small flocks, preaching in Latin and local dialects. The rhythm of life was changing, slower still perhaps, but different. The final unraveling came not with a single event, but as a drawn-out retreat. The Western Roman Empire, weakened from within and without, could no longer hold the frontier. In the 5th century, the legions were withdrawn, the cities abandoned or transformed. Roman Noricum faded, not vanished, but dissolved into the landscape. Its roads remained, its place names lingered. The people too remained, no longer Roman in title, but shaped by centuries of Roman influence. It is easy to think of this as an end, but perhaps it is better understood as a transformation. The Roman world did not disappear. It became quieter, more local, more rural. The grand structures crumbled, but the habits endured. Even as new tribes moved in, Bavarians, Slavs, later Avars, the land carried echoes of its Roman past, in the layout of fields, in the buried stones of forgotten villas, in the words that lingered in the vernacular. Thus ends this quiet chapter of Austria's early past, a period not of sweeping change, but of gradual absorption, from Celtic hill forts to Roman outposts, from tribal confederations to provincial order. Noricum was never a centre of power, but it was a place where the slow currents of history flowed steadily, shaping a land and a people in ways that would last far longer than any emperor's reign. As the long shadow of the Roman Empire faded from the valleys and foothills of what had once been Noricum, the landscape of early medieval Austria began to shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The great stone roads remained, though grasses grew between their cracks. The villas and bathhouses crumbled, their stones taken for other uses. The Latin tongue gave way to new languages, rougher, earthier, shaped by different rhythms. And in this quiet interlude, new peoples arrived, not in conquest, but in gradual settlement, among them the Bavarians. The Bavarians were not so much an invading force as a migrating community. Germanic in language, rooted in the broader patterns of post-Roman movement, they drifted eastward from their heartlands in what is now southern Germany. Their presence in Austria, particularly in the north and west, grew slowly throughout the 6th and 7th centuries. It was not marked by battle lines, but by field boundaries, not by kings, but by kin groups settling into valleys, clearing forests, and raising timber homes. They brought with them their own customs, shaped by a pastoral way of life. Simple wooden churches began to rise, though at first these were rare. The Bavarians were nominally Christian, thanks to earlier Roman missions and Frankish influence, but their Christianity was still tentative, mixed with older beliefs inherited from the pre-Christian Germanic world. The old gods were not easily forgotten, especially in the quiet corners of the countryside, where stories lived longer than sermons. It was during this time that the process of Christianization gathered pace, not in a moment, but in fits and starts, a slow layering of belief and structure encouraged by rulers, reinforced by missionaries. One of the earliest and most enduring efforts came from the West, from the Irish and Anglo-Saxon monastic traditions. Figures like Columbanus and his followers passed through the region on their way to found monasteries further afield, and though they did not stay long in Austria, their influence touched the soil. More lasting, however, was the work of Rupert of Salzburg, a nobleman turned bishop sent by the Bavarian duke to spread the Christian faith. Around the year 700, Rupert travelled to the ruins of the old Roman town of Uvavum, what had once been a small outpost, now half buried and forgotten. There, he established a new spiritual centre, reviving the town under the name Salzburg, the Salt Castle, so called for the nearby salt mines that had long been worked in the region. Rupert built churches, founded monasteries, and gently encouraged conversion. His work was not forceful, but steady, marked by quiet conviction rather than zeal. The monasteries that grew under his influence became not only places of worship, but centres of learning and agriculture. The monks copied texts, cultivated vineyards, and taught the surrounding communities. Theirs was a world of bells and prayers, of lit candles and plain song, of routines followed day after day, a rhythm not so different from that of the farmers who lived nearby. And slowly a new Christian identity began to take hold in these Bavarian lands. In the east and south of Austria, however, the picture was more complex. These regions remained more fluid, more contested. Here lived Slavic tribes, settlers who had moved into the region in the wake of Rome's retreat, particularly along the rivers and lower valleys. They had their own ways, their own gods, their own languages. For a time, the Slavs formed small principalities, sometimes allying with Bavarians, sometimes resisting. In Carantania, a loose Slavic polity took shape, governed not by feudal lords, but by assemblies and tribal customs. Carantania, centered roughly in today's Carinthia, is one of the more curious and often overlooked fragments of Austrian history. Its rulers were chosen through ritual rather than inheritance. One of the most enduring of these rituals involved a peasant seated on a stone who would question the incoming duke in the local tongue. Only after satisfying the peasant's inquiries could the duke be accepted by the people. A symbolic inversion where the humble held momentary power over the great. It speaks to a different tradition, one not yet shaped by the hierarchies of Christendom. But even Carantania could not remain separate forever. By the mid-8th century, Bavarian influence was growing. The dukes of Bavaria, now aligned with the rising Frankish realm under the Carolingians, sought to extend their reach. Christian missionaries followed, supported by political pressure. One such figure was Modestus, known as the Apostle of Carantania. Under his guidance, churches were built and Christian rites slowly took root. By the 740s, Carantania had become a vassal of Bavaria, and through Bavaria of the Franks. Thus began the long weaving of Austria into the Carolingian world, a process of ecclesiastical alignment and political integration. Charlemagne, the Frankish king and later emperor, would formalize these arrangements. He restructured the region into border zones, marches, designed to defend the empire's eastern edge from external threats, particularly from the Avars, a powerful confederation of steppe peoples who had established a khaganate beyond the Danube. These eastern marches, while militarized, were also places of settlement. Under Charlemagne's reign, Frankish nobles were granted lands, monasteries received royal patronage, and the church continued its slow expansion. The Avars were gradually pushed back, their power broken by a series of campaigns. And though they faded from history, their presence lingered in the landscape, in place names, in legends, in the careful caution of borderland communities. By the 9th century, Austria, as it would one day be known, was a patchwork of Marcher territories, Bavarian counties, and Christian enclaves. Not yet a nation, not yet a duchy, but something coalescing. The Danube once again marked a boundary, not of empire, but of faith and influence. The north bank was under Frankish sway, the south still more fluid, yet even here the monasteries held on, quiet islands of Latin learning in a sea of spoken dialects and shifting power. The rhythm of life in these centuries was slow, the plough more present than the sword. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. The great currents of history passed overhead, felt more in taxes and tithes than in battles. The Christianization of Austria was not an event, but a slow unfurling, shaped as much by farmers and monks as by dukes and bishops, a gradual layering of symbols, habits, and beliefs, until one day, perhaps a child growing up in the shadow of a wooden church would no longer remember a time when the land had belonged to another god. And so this chapter ends, with a land still forming, still finding its voice, not yet Austria, but something preparing for it, shaped by the Bavarians who settled, the Slavs who stayed, and the quiet persistence of those who prayed in Latin under cold stone arches, waiting for the dawn. As the mists of the early Middle Ages began to lift and Europe emerged, slowly and unevenly, from the long twilight that had followed Rome's decline, the lands that would become Austria began to take on clearer form, not suddenly and not without ambiguity, but with the steady hand of administration, of titles granted and borders drawn. It was in this period, around the late 10th century, that the name Austrici first appeared, a modest entry in a document from the year 996, referring to a region near Neuhofen under Ibs. It was a word that meant Eastern Realm in the old High German tongue, a name that would, with time, soften into Österreich, Austria. But even before the name was fixed, the shape of the land had begun to coalesce. In the waning years of the Carolingian Empire, as the great Frankish realm fragmented under the weight of internal strife and external pressure, the need for strong local governance became increasingly clear, particularly along the empire's vulnerable edges. The eastern frontier, once threatened by Avars, now faced new uncertainties, and so it was that the concept of the March, a militarized border zone, became a tool of imperial policy. Among the marches established in this period was the Marcha Orientalis, or Eastern March, a stretch of land roughly aligned with modern Lower Austria, not yet a duchy, nor a kingdom, but a frontier, wild in parts, only loosely settled, and entrusted to the care of loyal vassals of the king. Its purpose was not simply to defend, but to cultivate, to draw settlers, to establish order, to build churches and castles, and to extend the reach of Christian Europe eastward in quiet, steady fashion. Into this setting stepped the Babenbergs, a noble family of Frankish origin, first entrusted with the Eastern March in the year 976. Their founder, Leopold I, was appointed Margrave by Emperor Otto II, not because he was a conqueror, but because he was trusted, loyal to the Ottonian line, competent, pious, and able to govern the edge of empire with both firmness and patience. Under his watch, and that of his descendants, the Babenberg line would turn the March into a true principality, modest at first, but steadily growing. The Babenbergs did not rule with splendor or spectacle. Theirs was a quieter sort of governance, rooted in feudal obligation and ecclesiastical support. They relied heavily on the church, granting lands to monasteries and bishops in exchange for prayers, loyalty, and administrative support. Monastic centres like Melk, Heiligenkreuz, and Klosterneuburg became both spiritual and economic anchors, places where the land was cultivated, Latin texts copied, and new settlers welcomed. The Babenbergs understood that power in this region depended not just on arms, but on rootedness, on being part of the land's rhythm. As the decades passed, the Babenberg Margraves expanded their influence through marriages, grants, and steady colonization. They brought German-speaking settlers into sparsely populated areas, particularly along the Danube. These settlers, often peasants from Bavaria or Swabia, cleared forests, built villages, and cultivated fields. It was not glamorous work, but it transformed the landscape, turning wilderness into pasture and frontier into homeland. The towns that began to form were small but vital. Places like Krems, Tulln, and Vienna, then still little more than a fortified settlement on the Danube, began their slow ascent. Vienna, or Wien as it would come to be known, held strategic importance. Situated on a river crossing at the edge of the Hungarian plain, it served as both a military outpost and a trading post. The Habsburgs fortified it, gradually expanding its walls and infrastructure. Yet even in these early years, it remained a modest place, a town of merchants, craftsmen, and churchmen. Its skyline marked more by spires than towers, its streets muddy, its air filled with the smell of hearth fires and livestock. In 1156, a turning point arrived. The Privilegium Minus, issued by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, elevated the Babenberg lands from a margraviate to a duchy. Leopold V, the ruling Babenberg at the time, became the first Duke of Austria. This elevation was not merely ceremonial, it gave the Babenbergs greater autonomy, the right to pass the title hereditarily, and the ability to shape their realm more independently of the emperor. It marked Austria's quiet rise from frontier to principality, a recognition of what had already been unfolding on the ground. The Babenbergs, now ducal, continued to build churches, castles, bridges. They encouraged trade, established markets, and issued coins. Theirs was a world increasingly connected to the broader Holy Roman Empire, yet still distinctly local in flavour. They were not great warriors, nor famed patrons of the arts, but they were builders in the old sense, constructors of order, of institutions, of continuity. One of the more enduring legacies of the Babenbergs was their support for the Church, not only in terms of land and privilege, but in fostering a cultural identity rooted in Latin Christianity. Monasteries became repositories of memory and prayer, and cathedrals, though still modest in scale, became focal points for community life. It is during this time that the seeds of Austria's enduring Catholic identity were sown, not by decree, but by habit, by centuries of shared rites, of feasts and fasts, of baptisms and burials. Yet even the Babenbergs could not escape the pull of dynastic uncertainty. When Duke Frederick II, the last of his line, died childless in 1246, a period of interregnum followed. Various claimants emerged, among them the powerful Przemyslid kings of Bohemia. And for a time, Austria was pulled into a broader web of Central European politics. Yet even in this moment of uncertainty, the legacy of the Babenbergs endured. The structures they had built, the settlements they had fostered, and the very idea of Austria as a defined territory. These did not vanish. It is a curious thing to look back on this period not for its battles or conquests, but for its quiet formation. The Babenbergs, in their nearly 3 centuries of rule, did not command empires or forge revolutions, yet they laid the groundwork for something lasting. A land that had once been a march, a margin, had become a place with its own rhythm, its own loyalties. The name Austriaci, once a passing phrase, had taken root. And so the Babenberg chapter ends not with drama, but with a gentle handover, from one dynasty to another, from a margraviate to a duchy, from frontier to homeland, in the stillness of abbey cloisters and the bustle of emerging towns. Austria had begun to find its shape, not yet a nation, but something more than a borderland, a place where history, like the Danube itself, moved slowly, but with purpose. With the end of the Babenberg line in 1246, the land of Austria entered a time of uncertainty, a quiet interlude marked not by chaos, but by ambiguity. The territory remained, its towns and monasteries still functioning, its fields still tilled, but its governance lacked clarity. For years, various noble houses vied for control, including the powerful Przemyslid kings of Bohemia, and though their hold was for a time firm, it was not to last. The death of King Ottokar II at the battle on the Marchfeld in 1278 opened the door to a new chapter, and into that opening stepped a family whose name would come to define Austria for centuries: the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were, at the time, not a grand dynasty. They held lands in what is now Switzerland, respectable but modest. Their rise was not sudden, but the product of shrewd alliances, patient ambition, and a knack for being in the right place at the right time. In 1273, Rudolf of Habsburg was elected King of the Romans, effectively the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, not the most powerful candidate, but one seen as palatable to the great electors, a man of noble lineage, but not threatening in his power. Rudolf quickly set his sights on securing territory for his family, not by conquest, but through imperial authority. And so it was that in 1282, his sons Albert and Rudolf were granted the Duchy of Austria along with Styria. Thus began the long Habsburg association with Austria, an association that would stretch in various forms until the very end of the monarchy in the 20th century. At first, the Habsburg hold on Austria was tentative. They were newcomers and not always welcomed by the local nobility. Albert I, the elder of the two brothers, would eventually become sole ruler, and he worked to consolidate Habsburg authority. His rule, though firm, was not overly disruptive. The structures put in place by the Babenbergs remained, and the rhythms of Austrian life continued. It was not through revolution, but through continuity, that the Habsburgs made their mark. The early Habsburg dukes focused on governance, on securing loyalty, managing estates, and ensuring that Austria remained part of the broader imperial fabric. There were tensions, to be sure, occasional conflicts with the cities, with rival nobles, and with neighbouring powers, but these were managed rather than inflamed, and gradually the Habsburgs came to be seen not just as foreign rulers, but as local lords, rooted in the land, patrons of churches, builders of castles. It was not until the 15th century that their fortunes took a dramatic turn. Through a series of well-considered marriages and political manoeuvres, the Habsburgs expanded their holdings across Europe, most notably through the marriage of Frederick III to Eleanor of Portugal, and later of his son Maximilian I to Mary of Burgundy. These unions brought vast territories under Habsburg control, including parts of the Low Countries and Burgundy, and laid the groundwork for an empire that would span the globe. Yet amidst this growing grandeur, Austria remained the heart of the Habsburg patrimony. Vienna, once a small fortified town, had grown into a ducal residence. Its streets widened, its churches expanded, its court beginning to reflect the dignity of a rising dynasty. Under Frederick III, who was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1452, Vienna became an imperial city, not ostentatious, but quietly significant. A place where policy was debated, where alliances were forged, and where the slow wheels of administration turned. Frederick was a cautious ruler, not given to drama or haste. His motto, "AEIOU," a cryptic phrase thought to mean "all the world is subject to Austria" in Latin, captured both the ambition and the ambiguity of his reign. He was not a great warrior, nor a flamboyant sovereign, but he understood the value of longevity, of outlasting one's rivals, and in this he succeeded. When he died in 1493, his son Maximilian inherited not just Austria, but a position of growing prominence within Europe. Maximilian I is often seen as a bridge between the medieval and modern, a ruler of vision and energy, yet deeply rooted in tradition. He strengthened the Habsburg hold on Austria, reorganized its administration, and promoted its cultural life. He married his son Philip to Joanna of Castile, thereby setting the stage for the eventual unification of the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg lines. But even as his influence spread, Austria remained central to his sense of identity. It was not just a possession, but a home, a place from which he could draw strength. The Austria of the late 15th and early 16th centuries was still largely rural. Most people lived in villages, tied to the land. The nobility held estates, the church held power, and the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons and the liturgical calendar. But change was in the air. Towns were growing, trade routes expanding, and the first stirrings of the Reformation would soon unsettle the religious order. Yet for now, the Habsburgs remained secure. Their rule increasingly accepted, their lineage respected. It is worth noting that the Habsburgs did not seek to transform Austria into a modern state, at least not at this stage. Theirs was a feudal realm, rooted in custom and hierarchy. They ruled by consensus, by privilege, by careful balancing of interests. They were more administrators than visionaries, and this perhaps was their strength. They allowed Austria to grow at its own pace, to mature without rupture. Their governance was often slow, but it was steady. As we close this chapter, the outlines of Austria have begun to harden. Its position within the Holy Roman Empire is secure, its rulers established, its institutions forming. The Habsburgs, once outsiders, are now inseparable from its identity. And though their empire would expand far beyond the Alps, their heart remained in the Danube Valley, in the quiet strength of Vienna, in the monasteries of Melk and Klosterneuburg, in the snow-covered hills and meadows where the past clings to the landscape like morning fog. It is here, in this steady ascent from margin to monarchy, that Austria begins to take the shape we recognize today, not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of a dynasty built to endure. By the time the 19th century began to dawn, Austria was no longer merely a duchy tucked into the shadow of the Alps, nor even simply the heart of a once loose Holy Roman Empire. It had become something much larger, much more complex, and also, in a way, more fragile. A layered, multilingual, multi-ethnic expanse that sprawled across Central Europe. It was not called Austria alone now, but rather the Austrian Empire, and later still the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an entity as delicate as it was vast, composed not of a single people or language, but of many, each with its own rhythm, its own history, its own sense of place. At its height, this empire stretched from the alpine lakes of present-day Austria and Switzerland to the fertile plains of Hungary, from the quiet hills of Bohemia and Moravia to the deep forests of Galicia. It encompassed Italians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Jews, and of course, Germans and Hungarians. The emperor ruled them all, at least in theory, though in practice, the daily lives of most subjects were shaped more by village priests and local magistrates than by imperial decree. The Habsburgs, now styled as emperors rather than mere archdukes, presided over this mosaic not with flamboyance, but with a kind of cautious solemnity. They understood that holding such a patchwork together required careful attention, not grand gestures, but quiet accommodation. Bureaucracy flourished, ministries multiplied, and Vienna became a capital not just of Austria, but of administration itself. A city where civil servants outnumbered aristocrats, where policy papers piled higher than swords. In the countryside, life continued with familiar slowness. In the Tyrolean valleys, peasants tended to cattle and mowed alpine meadows. In Bohemia, farmers harvested barley for beer and children learned their prayers in Czech. In Transylvania, Orthodox villagers sang old songs in Romanian, while Greek Catholic priests read scripture in Church Slavonic. It was a world of layered identities, where one could be both local and imperial, loyal to the emperor, but rooted in the rhythms of one's native tongue, one's parish, one's village. The empire's strength, if it had one, was in this very layering, in the way it allowed different peoples to coexist under a single, overarching structure. But this strength was also its weakness. For as the 19th century unfolded, the idea of the nation-state began to gain ground across Europe, and with it came new pressures, questions of language, of autonomy, of self-determination, questions the empire was not always equipped to answer. The 1867 Ausgleich, or compromise, was one such answer, an attempt to reconcile the growing demands of Hungary with the unity of the empire. It created a dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary, two distinct halves, each with its own parliament and administration, united under a single monarch. Franz Joseph I, who had ruled since 1848, now became Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. The arrangement was a delicate one, more pragmatic than idealistic. It satisfied some, alienated others, and left many questions unresolved. For many in the Austrian half of the empire, especially the Germans of Vienna and the surrounding provinces, the compromise brought a sense of stability. But for others, Czechs, Poles, Slovenes, and others, it underscored their marginalization. In schools, in courts, in public offices, language became a battleground. Which tongue should be used, which scripts displayed, which histories taught. These were not abstract debates, but matters of daily importance. And though the empire tried to accommodate diversity, it often did so clumsily or too late. Still, despite its growing challenges, the empire persisted. Vienna, ever the quiet heart, grew into a grand capital, its streets filled with carriages, its cafes with writers and thinkers. Its architecture spoke in soft grandeur, ring roads lined with palaces and ministries, theatres and universities. A city of culture and protocol, where even the tempo of life seemed orchestrated, slow, deliberate, always aware of tradition. Beyond the capital, other cities thrived in their own way. Prague, with its Gothic spires and Czech revivalism. Budapest, grand and energetic, reflecting the pride of a rising Hungarian middle class. Lemberg, Krakow, Trieste, each with its own pulse, its own voice, connected by railways, by imperial post, by a shared, if fragile, idea of belonging to something larger. Yet even as the empire hummed with life, the cracks continued to widen. The Habsburg monarchy, for all its endurance, had become a symbol of both stability and stagnation. Emperor Franz Joseph, ever dignified, seemed increasingly a figure of the past, respected, even revered, but not necessarily loved. He ruled with a sense of duty, not charisma. His court was austere, his life marked by personal tragedy. The suicide of his son, Crown Prince Rudolf, at Mayerling in 1889, the assassination of his wife, Empress Elizabeth, in 1898. These events cast long shadows, felt not just in palace corridors, but in the quiet thoughts of ordinary people. And so, as the 20th century approached, the empire stood at a crossroads. Still functioning, still full of life, but increasingly uncertain of its future. National movements grew bolder. Labor strikes became more frequent. And in the cafes of Vienna, thinkers like Freud and Wittgenstein questioned the very foundations of identity and order. The empire, for all its rules and rituals, seemed less sure of itself than ever. Yet it is important to remember that for millions, daily life remained unchanged. Bakers baked, priests gave sermons, children played in the fields, weddings were held, crops harvested, prayers whispered at bedside. The empire may have been complex, even confusing, but it was also home, a place where the mundane routines of life unfolded with quiet familiarity, where one could be Croatian in speech, Catholic in faith, imperial in allegiance, all without contradiction. This, perhaps, is the essence of the Austro-Hungarian mosaic, not its politics or its military structure, but its people. The way they lived, side by side, side, across valleys and mountains, cities and villages, connected not by uniformity, but by the slow, shared rhythms of imperial life. And though the empire would not last, the traces of its layered past remain, in languages spoken, in customs retained, in the quiet dignity with which ordinary lives were lived. As we close this chapter, the empire still stands, proud if weary, vast if vulnerable, its trains still running, its bells still tolling. A gentle, ponderous giant, holding together for now, though the winds of change are already stirring. If one were to drift softly through the broad boulevards and narrow alleys of late imperial Vienna, one might begin to sense a kind of paradox, a city that was both the center of an empire and yet somehow distant from the tempo of imperial ambition. It was a capital, to be sure, a place of decision-making, of ceremonies and decrees, but also a city that wore its importance lightly, content in many ways to conduct the affairs of state with quiet solemnity, rather than spectacle or sound. Vienna in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was a place of order, an order not imposed with force, but maintained through ritual. The imperial court, seated at the Hofburg Palace, was the beating heart of this order, though its beat was slow and measured, governed by protocol, layered in tradition. It was not a court of glittering balls and flamboyant monarchs like Versailles or St. Petersburg. Rather, it was a court of schedules and silence, of morning audiences and meticulously arranged documents. Emperor Franz Joseph I, who reigned from 1848 until his death in 1916, embodied this ethos perfectly, rising each morning before dawn, dressed with the help of valets who followed the same routine every day. His breakfast laid out with precision, his papers read in silence, his appointments timed to the minute. He worked from modest offices within the Hofburg, surrounded not by grandeur, but by neat stacks of correspondence and ledgers. He did not seek to dazzle, only to endure. And in doing so, he gave the empire a center of gravity, even as the world around it shifted. Those who worked within the court were bound by a similar rhythm: ministers, secretaries, chamberlains, their movements choreographed by rules that had scarcely changed in generations. There were uniforms for every occasion, forms of address for every rank. To speak out of turn or to dress incorrectly was not merely impolite, it was almost unthinkable. And yet, within this rigid framework, life continued with surprising gentleness. Conversations were hushed, tempers rare. The court did not command loyalty by fear, but by habit, by being always, predictably there. Beyond the Hofburg, the wider city echoed this sense of composed order. The Ringstrasse, Vienna's great circular boulevard, had been built in the mid-19th century to house the institutions of the modern state: the parliament, the city hall, the Burg Theatre, the university, each designed in a style meant not to shock but to reassure: neo-Gothic, neo-classical, neo-Renaissance, each drawing on the past to give shape to the present. The effect was one of continuity, of calm confidence, as if the empire could go on forever simply by continuing what it was already doing. Life in the Viennese suburbs followed a different tempo. Here the houses were more modest, the air filled with the scent of baking bread and wood smoke. Families lived in close quarters, neighbours knew one another, and the rhythms of the day were marked more by the church bell than by imperial decree. Shops opened early, markets bustled gently, children walked to school in neat lines. For most residents, the empire was not an abstraction, but a part of their routine. It issued their currency, printed their stamps, taught their children, not with drama, but with persistence. The cafes of Vienna, too, played their quiet role, places of conversation and reflection, where writers, clerks, and students would sit for hours over a single coffee. The waiters moved slowly, their uniforms impeccable, their service unobtrusive. Newspapers were available on long wooden holders, allowing patrons to read without haste. It was here, in these calm interiors, that many of the empire's greatest minds lingered, discussing not politics often, but ideas, art, philosophy, the nuances of a sonata or a stanza. The empire's greatest debates, it sometimes seemed, occurred over strudel and espresso. Art and music formed another pillar of Viennese life, not in the form of grand revolution, but of refined evolution. The opera house, the Musikverein, and countless salons echoed with the works of composers old and new, Brahms and Bruckner, Mahler and Strauss. Their music was not always loud, but it carried weight, reflecting the subtle tensions of a society that prized restraint, but felt change approaching. Paintings, too, shifted slowly from historic scenes to quiet introspection. The works of Klimt and Schiele, though daring in style, emerged not as rebellion, but as expression of inner unease. Education and science flourished in much the same way. The University of Vienna stood as a beacon of scholarship, its lecture halls filled with the soft scratch of pens, the gentle drone of professorial voices. Names like Freud, Boltzmann, and Mach whispered through its corridors. Men who questioned the nature of the mind, of matter, of meaning itself. Yet they did so not in revolution, but in quiet pursuit of knowledge. Their world still one of blackboards, of late-night writing, of long, ponderous walks through leaf-strewn parks. Religious life remained ever-present, though rarely ostentatious. Catholic churches dotted the cityscape, their spires rising modestly above tiled rooftops. Masses were held not in splendour, but in routine. Parishioners knew their priests. Children learned their catechism. Festivals were marked with processions and hymns. For Vienna's Jews, who made up a vibrant and significant part of the city's population, religious life took took many forms, from the traditional rites of the synagogue to the secular engagement with literature and science. Here too the rhythms were layered, observant, reforming, assimilated, all moving through the same streets, speaking the same German while carrying different memories. At the imperial court, seasons passed almost imperceptibly. The emperor's schedule varied little between winter and summer. Easter brought solemn liturgies, Christmas a quiet dignity. The court's mourning rituals were elaborate but subdued. When members of the imperial family died, as they often did, their passing was marked not with grand gestures, but with long silences, draped mirrors, dark clothing, and the slow tolling of bells. It was not a court that demanded attention, only that one notice its constancy. And through it all, Franz Joseph remained, a figure of almost mythic stillness, aged, stoic, dressed always in military uniform, even in old age. He seemed to embody not just the empire, but the idea of endurance itself. His presence reassured even as the world around him changed. His court did not dazzle, but it anchored, and in that anchoring, it allowed millions to believe that things might go on as they always had. As we linger here, in the softly lit corridors of the Hofburg, or beneath the canopy of chestnut trees in the Volksgarten, it is tempting to imagine that nothing would ever truly change, that the empire and the quiet power of its court might last simply by remaining still. But already, beyond the city's edge, forces were gathering, louder, faster, more insistent. They had not yet breached the walls, but their echo could be heard faintly in the distance. For now, though, Vienna sleeps. The emperor at his desk, the court at its stations, the cafes full but calm. Life continuing in its quiet, deliberate way, like the ticking of a great clock, whose chimes no one yet suspects may soon fall silent. In the late 18th century, long before the Austro-Hungarian Empire had taken its final form, there came a moment of quiet restlessness within the Habsburg realm. Not a revolution, not quite, but a stirring, a gentle unease, the sense that things, as they had always been, might not be as they ought to be. And at the centre of this slow, intellectual shift stood Joseph II, a ruler unlike most of his predecessors, more prone to thought than tradition, more inclined to act than to observe. Joseph became Holy Roman Emperor in 1765 and co-ruler of the Habsburg lands alongside his mother, Maria Theresa. Upon her death in 1780, he ruled alone, and what followed was a reign characterized by a determined, if often misunderstood, drive for reform. Joseph was not a romantic, nor was he, in any real sense, a revolutionary. He was rather an administrator of unusual ambition, a man who believed in reason, in order, and in the idea that good government might improve lives, quietly, methodically, without fanfare. Under his guidance, the Austrian lands saw a wave of reforms, some small, some sweeping. Monasteries deemed unproductive were dissolved, their revenues redirected to fund education, hospitals, and secular clergy. Serfdom, though still entrenched, was softened. Peasants granted greater freedom to move and to marry without noble permission. Religious tolerance was extended, particularly to Protestants and Jews, who had long lived under legal restriction. The bureaucracy was streamlined, the legal code standardized, and German declared the official language of administration across the diverse lands of the empire. These changes were not always welcomed. In the quiet corners of rural Bohemia or among the Catholic nobility of Hungary, Joseph's reforms were seen not as progress, but as intrusion. Traditions that had endured for generations were upended in a few brief years. Old privileges eroded, familiar rituals disrupted. The emperor's good intentions, though sincere, often came cloaked in impatience. And when resistance came, he responded not with empathy, but with more decrees. Vienna, as always, remained the calm centre, its civil servants adjusting to new laws with the same steady diligence, its scholars discussing the Enlightenment in hushed tones over coffee and ink-stained notebooks. But in the provinces, the reforms stirred unease, not enough to spark rebellion, but sufficient to create a quiet withdrawal of support. When Joseph died in 1790, worn and disappointed, many of his policies were quickly reversed or softened by his successor, and yet something of his vision endured. Not the details, perhaps, but the notion that the state might be an instrument of improvement, not merely of preservation. Into the early 19th century, Austria found itself once again drawn into the broader conflicts of Europe. The French Revolution, and later Napoleon, reshaped the continent, not just its borders, but its assumptions. The Holy Roman Empire, once the notional framework of Central European order, was formally dissolved in 1806, and with it, the old dream of a patchwork of princely allegiances under a German emperor faded into memory. In its place rose the Austrian Empire, declared in 1804 by Francis II, who became Francis I of Austria. An empire in name, but still deeply feudal in practice, cautious, layered, and ever vigilant. It was in the wake of Napoleon's defeat at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 that Austria's next great steward emerged. Prince Clemens von Metternich, not a ruler, but a statesman, not a revolutionary, but a restorer. Metternich, suave, deliberate, deeply conservative, became the architect of post-Napoleonic Europe. His goal was not innovation, but equilibrium. He sought to preserve the old order by carefully balancing the ambitions of the great powers: Russia, Prussia, Britain, France, and of course, Austria. The result was a Europe largely at peace for several decades, but also one where the winds of change were kept firmly at bay. Within the Austrian Empire, Metternich's influence was quiet but pervasive. Censorship was tightened, secret police expanded, universities kept under close watch. National movements, whether among the Czechs, the Hungarians, or the Italians, were suppressed. Not brutally, for the most part, but systematically. Ideas deemed dangerous were snuffed out not with fire, but with silence. Careers stalled, publications blocked, discussions discouraged, and yet life went on. Vienna under Metternich remained orderly, polite, its boulevards clean, its churches full, its officials punctual. It was a city where politeness masked tension, where young men debated poetry rather than politics, and music carried more meaning than speech. Biedermeier, the style of the time, reflected this mood: introspective, domestic, quietly refined, drawing rooms filled with soft furniture, framed prints of alpine landscapes, and ticking clocks. It was a world turned inward, seeking comfort in the familiar, the small, the well-arranged. In the countryside, meanwhile, the rhythms of life changed little. Peasants still rose with the sun, attended mass on Sundays, paid their dues to the local landlord. Serfdom had been formally abolished. but deference remained. In the multi-ethnic provinces, local identities endured. Slovene farmers, Croatian fishermen, Ruthenian shepherds, all living lives largely untouched by imperial policy, so long as taxes were paid and peace maintained. Metternich's system was not without merit. It provided stability, and many were grateful for it. After decades of war, of upheaval, of shifting alliances, the predictability of Austrian rule offered a kind of shelter. Yet beneath the surface, pressures continued to build. The Industrial Revolution, though slower to reach Austria than Britain or Prussia, brought new forms of labour, new concentrations of people, new expectations, and with them, new frustrations. By the 1840s, unrest was spreading, harvests failed, prices rose, and across Europe, revolutions began to stir. In 1848, the great year of upheaval, Austria too was caught in the storm. Students took to the streets in Vienna, demanding constitutional reform. Hungarian leaders called for autonomy. Elsewhere, Czechs and Italians raised their own flags. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might unravel. Metternich, now old and increasingly out of step with the mood of the age, resigned and fled to England. The court, shaken, made concessions, but the moment passed. The army reasserted control and the monarchy endured. Yet the illusions of permanence had been shaken. Austria could no longer rely on ritual and repression alone. The people, diverse, multilingual, increasingly educated, were beginning to expect more. In the aftermath, the empire did attempt reforms. Slowly, cautiously. Constitutions were drafted and amended, parliaments convened, rights granted and then retracted. The balance between central control and regional identity became the defining question of Austrian politics, one not easily answered and never fully resolved. Yet even as change loomed, the old rhythms persisted. The imperial court remained. Franz Joseph, ascending to the throne in 1848 at the age of 18, would rule for nearly 60 years, 70 years, a figure of continuity in an age of flux. His reign, like that of Joseph II, would blend reform and reaction, but with far greater caution and far less certainty. And so, in this long, gentle arc from Joseph II to Metternich and beyond, Austria lived through a period not of clear transformation, but of tension between what was and what might be. A land ruled not by visionaries, but by stewards, not by revolution, but by ritual. The empire held, but its seams had begun to stretch, and in the quiet spaces of village and parlour, cafe and cloister, new questions were beginning to form. The 19th century, in its long and layered unfolding, brought to Austria not a single dramatic change, but a steady thickening of complexities. The empire, still ruled from the calm centre of Vienna, remained intact. Its emperor still received ambassadors, its ministries still issued edicts, its trains still ran across thousands of miles of landscape. But beneath this apparent continuity, the social and cultural fabric of the realm was shifting, quietly yet insistently, and at the heart of this shift was a question both new and ancient. What does it mean to belong? Austria had always been a land of many peoples. This was not new. What was changing was the way people thought about identity. In earlier centuries, one might be Ruthenian or Croatian, yet feel no contradiction in also being a loyal subject of the emperor. Religion, local custom, and dynastic loyalty had long provided a shared frame. But in the 19th century, a new language of identity began to emerge, rooted not in allegiance, but in nationhood, not in service to a monarch, but in membership of a people, and with it came new tensions. This shift was not unique to Austria, of course. Across Europe, the rise of nationalism reshaped political expectations. Movements in Italy and Germany sought unification. In France and Britain, national identity became ever more central to public life. But in the Austrian Empire, sprawling, multilingual, and deeply rooted in an older conception of governance, the challenge was sharper. Here were Czechs, Germans, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Magyars, Romanians, Slovenes, Croats, Italians, each with their own language, history, and emerging sense of national consciousness. At first, these stirrings were literary, cultural, even romantic. Poets rediscovered old ballads, philologists codified local dialects, historians traced the glories of medieval kingdoms. In Prague, young Czechs celebrated their Slavic heritage. In Lviv, Ruthenian scholars revived folk traditions. In Budapest, Hungarian nobles demanded not only self-rule, but recognition of their language in all public matters. What had begun as pride soon became politics. The Habsburg authorities, cautious and ever mindful of equilibrium, attempted to accommodate some of these demands. Schools were permitted to teach in local languages, regional assemblies gained modest powers, but German remained the language of imperial administration, and Vienna the seat of decision-making. The balance between unity and diversity proved increasingly difficult to maintain. For every concession, there came new demands, and for every delay, a fresh wave of discontent. The Compromise of 1867, the Ausgleich, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution by 1867 was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 1867, was meant to ease this pressure. It granted Hungary full autonomy within a dual monarchy, creating Austria-Hungary. Yet this very solution, by 18 elevating the status of one national group, alienated many others. Slovaks, Romanians, and Croats found themselves subject to Hungarian control without meaningful representation. Czechs, Slovenes, and Poles looked on uneasily. The empire had acknowledged nationalism, but only partially, and in doing so, had deepened the sense of exclusion among those left outside the new arrangement. In the Austrian half of the empire, the government attempted to manage diversity through careful administration. Censuses counted languages spoken, not ethnicities. Schools were regulated with attention to linguistic rights. Newspapers flourished in every tongue. But the administrative apparatus, though sincere in its efforts, often struggled to keep pace with the aspirations it sought to contain. Bureaucracy could provide services, but not always a sense of belonging. Amidst all this, life continued with its characteristic slowness. In the countryside, peasants still followed the cycle of planting and harvest. Weddings were celebrated with familiar songs, children baptized according to the rites of their ancestors. In the towns, shopkeepers set out their wares, craftsmen mended tools, and officials stamped documents in triplicate. The empire, for all its tensions, remained functional, its trains on time, its post delivered, its courts in session, the surface calm, even as deeper questions swirled beneath. Vienna, once more, offered its peculiar blend of quiet grandeur and subdued anxiety. The parliament, known as the Reichsrat, became a stage for competing national demands. Speeches delivered in Czech, German, Polish, and more. Arguments that sometimes stretched for hours, even days, not in pursuit of consensus, but in defense of position. Yet the very act of parliamentary debate, though often unproductive, gave shape to the idea of shared space, however fragile. In the universities and salons, the question of nationality was discussed not only in political terms, but as a question of culture, of psychology. Thinkers like Sigmund Freud, himself a product of the empire's multicultural margins, pondered identity not only in collective terms, but personal ones. What does it mean to be Austrian when one's language is German, one's faith Jewish, one's childhood shaped by Moravian customs, and one's adulthood by Viennese restraint? Such was the condition of many within the empire, layered, hybrid, quietly complex. By the close of the century, tensions remained unresolved. Nationalist movements continued to grow, yet so too did efforts to forge a common imperial identity. Railway posters printed in 6 languages, banknotes bearing multiple scripts, civil servants trained to navigate the linguistic maze. There were moments of cooperation, even affection. A Ruthenian schoolteacher in Galicia writing to a Slovene counterpart in Carniola about teaching methods. A Hungarian poet reading German translations of Czech verse in a Viennese cafe. Such moments did not erase division, but they complicated it, reminded one that the empire was not merely a puzzle of nations, but a tapestry of lives. And so Austria moved into the 20th century, not broken, but burdened, held together not by ideology or force, but by habit, by the quiet persistence of institutions, and by the dignity of a monarch who, though aging, remained steadfast. Franz Joseph, seated at his desk, receiving daily briefings in clipped phrases, remained the symbol of a state that endured not through brilliance, but through steadiness. Nationality in Austria was never a simple matter, not a binary, but a spectrum, not an answer, but a question lived daily, in the language one spoke at home and the one required at the office, in the songs one sang at weddings and the papers one filled out at City Hall. in the tensions and harmonies of a life lived within the soft, measured borders of a multinational empire. And as the sun set gently over the Carpathians, over the Adriatic, over the quiet Danube flowing through Vienna, the empire still stood, quiet, imperfect, gently swaying under the weight of its many voices, still listening, still enduring. By the early years of the 20th century, the Austro-Hungarian Empire stood as a strange monument to continuity, vast, aging, dignified, its institutions still functioning, its borders intact, yet its foundations, long settled into the earth, had begun to loosen, not through any single crisis, but through the cumulative weight of time, of unresolved tensions, and of a world beginning to move faster than the empire could follow. The monarch, Franz Joseph I, had become something of a living relic, a figure of immense personal discipline, still rising before dawn, still attending to his correspondence, still presiding over a court that clung to its ceremonies like ivy to stone. He was respected, even revered, but few believed he could chart a new course for the empire. He ruled not with vision, but with steadiness, and in doing so, he held together a realm increasingly unsure of itself. In the streets of Vienna and Budapest, the empire still appeared prosperous. New buildings rose in Art Nouveau style, trams clattered along well-paved avenues, and cafes remained filled with the gentle murmur of intellectual debate. Yet behind this calm lay discontent. National groups continued to press for greater autonomy. In the Hungarian half, policies of Magyarization alienated Slovaks and Romanians. In the Austrian half, Czechs sought parity with German speakers, while South Slavs looked increasingly to one another for cultural solidarity. Beneath the bureaucratic surface, the question of identity persisted. The same old question, now sharper. In schools, courts, parliaments, what language should be spoken? What history taught? What flag raised? The empire's answer: careful compromise, polite deferral, administrative accommodation, had held for decades, but it was growing threadbare. The old methods soothed, but no longer satisfied. Into this atmosphere came a sudden violence, not from within, but from beyond the empire's quiet border. On 28 June 1914, in the Bosnian town of Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a young Serb nationalist. It was a small act in a provincial city, but it struck at the heart of the empire's delicate equilibrium, and it triggered a sequence of diplomatic reactions that soon became unstoppable. Austria-Hungary, long cautious, now responded with unusual firmness, presenting Serbia with an ultimatum so severe that rejection seemed likely. And when it came, the empire declared war, not with fervour, but with solemnity, a war not of conquest, but of preservation, or so it was believed at the time. And yet, the war that followed would undo the very fabric it was meant to protect. At first, the empire moved as it always had, slowly, deliberately. Its generals relied on outdated strategies, its supply chains creaked, its multilingual army struggled with coordination. Soldiers from across the empire, Czechs, Poles, Ruthenians, Italians, Slovens, Croats, Hungarians, fought side by side, often with little understanding of each other's speech. In the Eastern Theatre, the Russian front proved costly. In the south, Italy joined the war against Austria-Hungary in 1915, opening a harsh mountain front that tested the limits of endurance. The home front, too, began to suffer. Food grew scarce, prices rose, and the once quiet routines of daily life were disrupted. Families watched sons leave for distant fronts, often never to return. Factories turned from peacetime goods to munitions, and even the cafes of Vienna grew quieter, their regulars thinned by conscription and the weight of war. Politically, the empire grew more brittle. Censorship increased, but so too did agitation. Nationalist movements, once cautiously patient, now saw opportunity in the empire's weakness. In Prague and Zagreb, in Lviv and Cluj, leaders began to imagine futures beyond Habsburg rule. The idea of Austria-Hungary as a shared home grew harder to sustain, not because of hatred, but because of weariness. The emperor himself, Franz Joseph, died in November 1916, after nearly 7 decades on the throne. His funeral procession moved through the streets of Vienna with quiet dignity. Black horses pulling the hearse, soldiers in mourning dress, citizens lining the route in respectful silence. For many, it marked the end of an era. His great-nephew, Charles III, succeeded him, a younger man, sincere and devout, who sought to make peace. But it was too late. By 1918, the empire was collapsing, not with explosion, but with quiet unraveling. One by one, its constituent nations declared independence. Czechoslovakia on 28 October, South Slavs forming the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes shortly after. Hungary severed ties. Galicia slipped into the orbit of reborn Poland. Even in Austria proper, the call for a republic was growing. By November, Charles had relinquished his participation in government, though he never formally abdicated. On the 12th of November 1918, the Republic of German Austria was proclaimed from the balcony of the Parliament building in Vienna. The Habsburg monarchy, after centuries of quiet endurance, was over, not through revolution, but through erosion. The vast empire, held together for so long by routine and ritual, had simply become too much to hold. The war, with its hunger and disillusionment, had stripped away the old certainties, and what remained was a series of new states, each seeking its own path. For the ordinary people of the former empire, the change was both immense and strangely mundane. Borders shifted, currencies changed, and allegiances were rewritten. Yet the fields still needed tending, the markets still opened, and children still went to school. The empire had disappeared, but life went on, in ways both altered and unchanged. The memory of the empire, however, lingered, not in triumph, but in melancholy, in the faded crests above post offices, in the yellowing photographs of uniformed relatives, in the rhythm of languages still spoken across its former lands. For many, it remained a lost world, not perfect, but familiar, not glorious, but human, a place where diversity had coexisted, however uneasily, under the slow ticking of an imperial clock. And so the empire ended, quietly, not with a crash, but with a long sigh. Its story folded into the broader narrative of 20th century Europe, its maps redrawn, its name consigned to history. Yet in the memory of those who had lived within it, there remained a sense of something shared, something worth remembering, if only in silence. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire faded quietly into the shadows of history in late 1918, the land that remained, what had once been its German-speaking core, found itself reduced, redefined, and largely unmoored. The new Republic of German Austria, declared from the stately balconies of Vienna's parliament, was to be something different. Not an empire, nor even a kingdom, but a modest republic, parliamentary in structure, humble in size, and uncertain of its future. The new Austria was, in many ways, an accident of collapse, its borders drawn not by long-standing desires, but by the sudden absence of empire. It comprised much of what we now recognize as Austria. Vienna and the surrounding provinces, Upper and Lower Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Tyrol, Salzburg, Vorarlberg, and Burgenland. Yet to many within it, the idea of a self-standing Austrian nation still felt unfamiliar, even unnatural. For centuries, Austria had been a dynastic identity, a Habsburg possession, a centre of imperial governance. To be Austrian, in the imperial sense, had been to be part of something larger. Now, that greater whole was gone. In the days that followed the war, there was a brief hope, quiet but widespread, that Austria might join the new German Republic, formed from the ashes of the German Empire. Such a union, it was thought, might give the small republic stability, economic viability, and cultural kinship, but the victorious Allied powers forbade it, fearing the potential for a larger unified German-speaking bloc, and so Austria remained on its own, small, landlocked, largely rural, and economically frail. The early years of the First Republic, as it came to be known, were marked by hardship. The war had drained resources, dislocated industries, and left much of the population struggling. Inflation soared, food shortages became common, and political tensions, long simmering, began to boil. On one side stood the Social Democrats, strong in urban areas like Vienna, who advocated for workers' rights, secular education, and progressive social policies. On the other, the Christian socials, rooted in rural conservatism and Catholic tradition, wary of socialism and committed to a more traditional vision of Austria. These two camps increasingly saw themselves not merely as rivals, but as enemies. Their supporters organized into paramilitary groups, the Schutzbund for the Social Democrats and the Heimwehr for the Christian Socials. While the government functioned, it did so amid constant tension. Coalition talks failed, budgets stalled, and compromise grew rare. And all the while, ordinary Austrians tried to rebuild their lives, repairing homes, replanting fields, reopening shops, carrying on as best they could. Vienna in this period took on a curious dual identity, politically divided but culturally vibrant. The Social Democrats, who controlled the city government, implemented an ambitious program of public housing, welfare, and education. They built large apartment complexes, Gemeindebauten, that offered modern amenities and a sense of dignity to working families. Schools were expanded, libraries opened, parks landscaped. It was a moment of quiet reform, often called Red Vienna, not for its militancy, but for its social vision. Beyond the capital, however, the picture was different. Many Austrians viewed these changes with suspicion. The countryside remained more traditional, more religious, more cautious, and in the growing climate of European instability, such divisions became more pronounced. Economic troubles persisted throughout the 1920s, worsened by the Great Depression in 1929. Unemployment rose, bank failures spread, and the fragile sense of national identity began to fray. The early 1930s brought political crisis, the rise of authoritarianism in neighbouring countries. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, cast long shadows. In Austria, the Christian social government, now under Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, moved to suspend parliament in 1933 and govern by decree, claiming the need to restore order and protect Austria from both the left and the Nazi right. Dollfuss outlawed the Austrian Nazi Party, but also banned the Social Democrats and their paramilitary groups. Political pluralism gave way to an authoritarian regime, small in scale but firm in posture. In 1934, civil conflict erupted. Social democratic workers in Vienna and other cities took up arms against the government, hoping to resist the slide into dictatorship. The fighting lasted only a few days, but it was fierce. Artillery was used in the streets of Vienna, and dozens were killed. The rebellion was crushed, and the First Republic was, in effect, over. In its place stood the so-called Austro-fascist regime, a corporatist, Catholic nationalist state, authoritarian in tone but distinct from the rising tide of German Nazism. Later that year, Dollfuss was assassinated by Austrian Nazis during a failed coup. His successor, Kurt Schuschnigg, continued the authoritarian model while trying to maintain Austrian independence from Hitler's growing Germany. Yet the pressure mounted. Many Austrians, disillusioned by economic hardship and attracted by pan-German nationalism, supported the idea of unification with the Reich. Others feared it, but felt powerless. Austria, always so careful in its balancing, was running out of room. By March 1938, under increasing threat from Hitler and with little support from abroad, Austria's government agreed to a referendum on union with Germany. Before it could be held, however, German troops crossed the border, welcomed in many towns by cheering crowds. The Anschluss, or annexation, was presented as a homecoming, a return of Austria to the broader German nation. And while some greeted it with flags and flowers, others watched in silence, uneasy, uncertain, aware that something quiet and complex had just been swept aside by something louder, sharper, more insistent. Austria, now part of the Third Reich, ceased to exist as a separate state, its institutions absorbed, its borders redrawn, its identity suppressed. The years that followed would bring darkness, war, persecution, loss. But within that darkness, the memory of the First Republic, its hopes, its struggles, its small persistent efforts to find a new path, remained, a reminder that Austria, even in its most uncertain hour, had tried to chart a course of its own. And so this chapter ends not with clarity, but with rupture, a republic born of collapse, tested by division, undone by force, yet not forgotten, its quiet moments of dignity and reform still echoing softly, like footsteps fading down a long marble corridor, still there, beneath the noise, waiting to be remembered. In the soft spring of 1938, as snow melted quietly from the alpine slopes and rivers ran a little faster through the valleys, a quiet and deeply significant transformation unfolded across Austria, though framed by parades and salutes, by banners and orchestrated jubilation. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany, was not so much an invasion as an absorption, an erasure of borders, of institutions, and for many, of identity. For years, Austria had stood delicately between competing visions of its future. Some looked westward, towards liberal democracy and cautious independence, others eastward to the rising shadow of fascism. But increasingly, particularly in the years following the Great Depression, the idea of a union with Germany gained traction, rooted not only in linguistic and cultural affinity, but in a shared sense of grievance and economic desperation. The old empire gone, the First Republic weakened by strife and the future uncertain, many Austrians longed for something more stable, more certain, more powerful. When German troops crossed the border on the 12th of March 1938, they met little resistance. In fact, in many towns and villages, they were welcomed, not universally, but visibly. The next day, Hitler entered Linz, the city of his youth, and soon after, he stood before cheering crowds in Vienna's Heldenplatz, declaring the union of Austria and Germany. The Anschluss was made official by law on the 13th of March and confirmed by a heavily manipulated plebiscite in April, showing an overwhelming, though deeply suspect, majority in favour. And with that, Austria ceased to exist as a state. It was now part of the German Reich, referred to as the Ostmark, governed by Nazi officials, its autonomy dissolved, its institutions dismantled or absorbed. The Austrian flag, its quiet red and white, was replaced by the stark swastika, its parliament shuttered, its parties banned, its political culture erased almost overnight. For many Austrians, particularly those aligned with the right, this was a moment of vindication. At long last, the old idea of a greater Germany had been realized, and yet, for others, it was the beginning of fear. Jewish communities, political dissidents, and anyone associated with the former republic soon faced a growing wave of persecution. Synagogues were vandalized, Jewish-owned businesses boycotted or seized, and individuals humiliated or attacked in the streets. The Anschluss unleashed a new violence, less an arrival of Nazi ideology than an eruption of forces already brewing beneath the surface. Austria's integration into the Reich was not symbolic, it was thorough. Administrative divisions were redrawn, with the country split into several Reichsgauer. Local governance placed firmly under Nazi control. Austrian civil servants, police and teachers were required to join the Nazi party or lose their positions. Education was reoriented to Nazi ideology, with classrooms echoing not with inquiry but with slogans and silence. Military conscription followed. Austrian men, now German citizens, were called into service. Many would fight and die on the front lines of the Second World War, indistinguishable from their counterparts elsewhere in the Reich. Some served willingly, others reluctantly, and some resisted in quiet, careful ways. But the machinery of the Nazi state left little room for refusal. The role of Austrians in the Nazi regime remains a subject of quiet, often painful reflection. Not only did many Austrians participate actively in the machinery of oppression, but some held prominent roles. Adolf Eichmann, one of the principal architects of the Holocaust, was born in Linz. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Security Main Office, was Austrian. The participation was not peripheral nor accidental, it was embedded. The Jewish population of Austria, once an integral, if often marginalized part of Viennese life, was subjected to the full horror of Nazi policy. Within weeks of the Anschluss, arrests began. Jews were dismissed from public positions, forbidden to practice professions, their property confiscated. Emigration, for those who could manage it, became a desperate scramble. By 1941, deportations to concentration camps began, and by war's end, over 60,000 Austrian Jews had been murdered. The great synagogues of Vienna were destroyed, and the community that had contributed so much to Austria's intellectual and cultural life was shattered. Yet amidst the horror, there were moments of quiet resistance. Some Austrians sheltered Jews at great personal risk. Others joined underground networks, distributed illegal leaflets, or simply refused to comply. Such acts were rarely grand or public, but they were real, and they remain part of the complex tapestry of Austrian experience in these dark years. The war itself, though initially distant for many within Austria, eventually made its presence felt. Allied bombings increased after 1943, targeting industrial areas, railway lines, and military sites. Vienna was hit repeatedly. The city's ornate facades blackened, its quiet streets punctuated by sirens and rubble. Food shortages became common, daily life increasingly precarious. The sense of control and order promised by the Nazi regime dissolved into fear and fatigue. By the spring of 1945, the war was drawing to a close. Soviet troops advanced from the east, reaching Vienna in April. The battle for the city was fierce, marked by street fighting and widespread destruction. When it was over, the Red Army occupied the capital, and soon Allied forces divided Austria into zones, mirroring the arrangement in Germany. Vienna itself was similarly divided, though governed jointly by the four powers. The Nazi regime collapsed with a kind of exhausted silence. Hitler, now dead in his Berlin bunker, was no longer a presence, and Austria, so long absorbed, began the slow process of re-emerging. But the question of identity remained unresolved. Had Austria been the first victim of Nazi aggression, as some would later claim, or had it been a willing participant, complicit in the crimes of the regime? The truth, as ever, was neither simple nor singular. It lived in the details, in the quiet choices made in homes and offices, in the faces turned away, in the hands extended. As the war ended and the world began to reckon with its aftermath, Austria stood once more at a crossroads. Physically battered, morally wounded, politically adrift, yet still standing, still present. A land preparing once again to begin anew, not as a return to empire, nor as an appendage to Germany, but as something quieter, smaller, and perhaps more honest. And so the Anschluss, which had begun with fanfare and promises of unity, ended in silence, in rubble, in reckoning, in the long shadows cast by choices made and paths taken. Austria had lost itself, and now, slowly, it would begin to find itself again, in the quiet spaces left behind by war. In the cool hush that followed the devastation of the Second World War, Austria found itself once more at the threshold of rebirth, not as a triumphant victor, nor as an empire restored, but as a nation humbled, uncertain, and searching for shape. The physical destruction, while considerable, bombed out buildings, damaged railways, shattered bridges, was in many ways easier to address than the deeper wounds left by complicity, silence, and erasure. From 1945 onwards, Austria was governed under Allied occupation, divided into 4 zones, each administered by one of the victorious powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France. Vienna, like Berlin, was likewise quartered, though jointly governed by the Allied Council. At first, the city remained subdued, its streets pocked with rubble, its people hollowed by years of war, scarcity, and fear. But beneath the surface, the quiet rhythms of life began to stir again. The first task was survival, and then, slowly, rebuilding. Soup kitchens opened, housing was repaired, schools resumed, trains began to run once more, though cautiously and with frequent delays. In markets, barter returned as a common means of exchange. Food, fuel, and basic goods were in short supply, and many families took to growing vegetables in every available patch of earth. The fields beyond the cities, once the domain of grand harvests, became sources of vital subsistence. Politically, Austria re-established a republic. The Second Republic, as it came to be known, was declared on 27th April 1945, its constitution restored from the 1920 model with amendments. Karl Renner, a seasoned social democrat and former chancellor, returned from political obscurity to lead the provisional government. His presence was, for many, a quiet reassurance. Not a figure of glamour, but of calm, administrative sense. One of the most enduring elements of this period was Austria's narrative of victimhood. As part of the 1943 Moscow Declaration, the Allies had stated that Austria was to be considered the first free country to fall victim to Hitlerite aggression, and this framing, however complex and contested, became the cornerstone of Austria's post-war identity. It allowed the new republic to distance itself from Nazi crimes, while quietly avoiding deeper confrontation with the extent of its collaboration. Trials were held, of course, and some individuals were prosecuted, but many former Nazis were reintegrated into public life with relative speed, especially as the Cold War began to reshape global priorities. In this shifting context, neutrality became Austria's defining posture, a deliberate decision not to align with either the Western Bloc, led by the United States, or the Eastern Bloc, dominated by the Soviet Union. This neutrality, however, was not granted freely. It came as part of a broader negotiation, the Austrian State Treaty, signed in May 1955. This treaty, reached after years of occupation and diplomacy, restored full sovereignty to Austria on the condition that it remain permanently neutral. No foreign military bases, no participation in military alliances. Austria would be, in effect, a buffer, a quiet space between louder neighbours. The neutrality, far from isolating Austria, became a point of pride, a symbol of independence, of dignity regained. Austrian diplomats, freed from the entanglements of bloc politics, carved out a role as mediators, hosts, and observers. Vienna became home to international organizations, most notably the United Nations offices. Its quiet, orderly atmosphere well suited to patient diplomacy. Domestically, the post-war years saw the emergence of what came to be called the propose system, a system of coalition governance and political consensus, primarily between the Social Democratic Party, SPO, and the Austrian People's Party, OVP. These two main parties, representing the broad ideological spectrum of the country, agreed to share power, appointments, and policy responsibilities, not in constant rivalry, but in careful balance. The aim was stability, not excitement, compromise, not confrontation, and while the system had its critics, it ensured that Austria avoided the kind of sharp polarization that had destabilized the First Republic. Economic recovery was slow but steady, aided by the Marshall Plan and by Austria's access to both Western markets and, more cautiously, Eastern ones. The 1950s and 60s brought new roads, factories, and schools. The Alpine regions, once rustic and remote, became centers of tourism. Ski resorts were built, guest houses opened, and Austria's scenic calm became its global signature. The very mountains that had once marked the edge of empire now became symbols of quiet prosperity. In cultural life, there was both continuity and subtle renewal. The great musical traditions, Mozart, Schubert, Strauss, were preserved and performed, but so too did new voices emerge. Literature and film began to explore Austria's recent past, though often obliquely. The war and the Holocaust remained topics treated with care and sometimes with avoidance. Public memory was shaped more by silence than by reckoning. Yet that silence was not complete. In families, in schools, in whispered conversations, the questions persisted. What had happened, and what had been done? The generation born after the war began to ask more insistently in the 1970s and beyond, and Austria's relationship with its past began to shift, not with abrupt confession, but with a slow unpeeling of denial. Memorials were erected, archives opened, and the quiet work of remembering began. Not to indict, but to understand, to gently reweave a history that had been frayed by omission. By the 1980s, Austria stood as a modest success, democratic, peaceful, prosperous, its neutrality held firm, its institutions stable, its people generally secure. Yet beneath the surface, the questions of identity remained, not of empire nor of monarchy, but of memory, what it meant to be Austrian, no longer defined by what one was part of, but by what one had lived through, and what one chose to acknowledge. And so, in this chapter of post-war reconstruction, Austria found a new rhythm, slower, steadier, less grand, a nation no longer at the center of Europe's ambitions, but quietly present, cultivating a gentler role, not through proclamations or power, but through patience, rebuilding not just buildings, but trust, identity, and the quiet confidence of a country learning once more to stand on its own. As the 20th century settled into its quieter decades, Austria emerged as a nation comfortably tucked into the middle, not just geographically, but politically, culturally, and emotionally. It was a country without grand ambitions, without revolutionary zeal, and without the heavy burden of international expectation. And for many Austrians, that was precisely the point. After decades of turmoil, collapse, annexation, and occupation, the modesty of the Second Republic became its strength, a place to live, not to conquer, to remember, not to repeat. The years following the restoration of full sovereignty in 1955 were marked by steady, unassuming progress. No dramatic reforms, no sweeping transformations, but a quiet continuity anchored by the twin pillars of political consensus and social cohesion. The proposed system, though often mocked for its bureaucracy and cronyism, offered stability. The two major parties, the conservative OVP and the social democratic SPÖ, alternated power or governed together in coalitions. Ministries, state-run companies, and public institutions were divided between them like family heirlooms. It was not elegant, but it worked. Under this arrangement, Austria developed a social market economy, balancing private enterprise with public services. Pensions, healthcare, housing, and education were gradually expanded, ensuring that the benefits of economic growth were widely shared. Vienna in particular continued to invest in public housing, parks, libraries, and transport. The city's gentle urbanity, a mix of old-world architecture and modern efficiency, reflected a broader national ethos, comfortable, understated, slightly formal, and quietly proud. The economy grew steadily throughout the 1960s and 70s, fueled by industrial development, foreign investment, and rising tourism. The Alps, once traversed by imperial armies and wartime refugees, now welcomed skiers and hikers from across Europe. Lakeside villages in Carinthia and Salzburg became holiday destinations. Cafes filled with visitors, and pensioners lingered over coffee and cakes in towns that had once echoed with far sterner conversations. The tone of national life softened. Politically, the 1970s brought a shift. Bruno Kreisky, a charismatic social democrat with a pragmatic touch, served as chancellor from 1970 to 1983. Under his leadership, Austria modernized quietly, expanding welfare policies, reforming education, and liberalizing aspects of civil law. Kreisky, himself of Jewish background, navigated Austria's memory politics with a deft, sometimes evasive hand. He preferred to focus on the future, on practicalities, on national confidence rather than guilt, and for a time, this approach resonated. Austria under Kreisky felt more assured, more forward-looking, though still wrapped in the language of consensus rather than confrontation. Yet the questions of the past did not remain silent. In 1986, the presidential election of Kurt Waldheim brought Austria's reckoning with its wartime history to the forefront. Waldheim, a former UN Secretary-General, had served in the German army during the Second World War, and as details of his service emerged, particularly concerning his time in the Balkans, a debate ignited, not only about the man, but about Austria's self-understanding. Was it truly a victim of Nazism, as the post-war narrative had long claimed, or had it been, in part, complicit? The Waldheim affair forced Austria to look more closely at its past, and while the immediate political fallout was limited, Waldheim was elected and served his term. It marked a turning point in public consciousness. Discussions once confined to academia and quiet corners became part of broader public life. School curricula were revised, memorials revisited, and the history of Austria's Jews, its deportees, its resistors, and its collaborators began to receive fuller attention. In tandem with this, Austria's cultural life remained rich. Its theatres, opera houses, and concert halls continued to thrive. The Vienna Philharmonic, the Salzburg Festival, and countless regional venues sustained traditions that stretched back centuries. Yet there was also a new current, a willingness to question, to reflect, to explore. Filmmakers like Michael Haneke and writers such as Thomas Bernhard and Elfriede Jelinek challenged the conventions of Austrian propriety, exposing the tensions beneath the surface calm. Their works were not always comfortable, but they were rooted in a desire for honesty, a wish to speak the unsaid. Austria's neutrality, affirmed in its 1955 state treaty and enshrined in its constitution, remained a cornerstone of national identity. The Cold War passed with Austria playing a quietly dignified role, a bridge between East and West, a site for diplomatic negotiations, a place where Soviet and Western officials might sit, if not together, then at least nearby. And when the Iron Curtain began to lift in the late 1980s, Austria found itself unexpectedly at the frontier of change. The fall of communism in neighbouring Hungary and Czechoslovakia brought waves of migration, new trade routes, and a subtle shift in Austria's self-perception. No longer a quiet western neighbour of Eastern Europe, Austria now found itself as a hub, a connector, a country with links in both directions. This shift brought both opportunities and anxieties, economic growth, but also competition, cultural exchange, but also the stirrings of nationalist sentiment. Into the 1990s, Austria entered the European Union, a move that reflected its broader integration into the post-Cold War European order. The neutrality remained, but softened. Austria was no longer isolated, but part of a shared project, and yet it did so in its own way, cautiously, incrementally, with attention to detail and a touch of skepticism. European, but not brashly so, modern, but politely rooted in its past. As the century came to a close, Austria stood not as a world power, nor even a regional one, but as a quiet republic, stable, democratic, culturally alive, a country that had been empire and battlefield, annexed and occupied, reborn and reformed, and that now, gently, had found a way to simply be, its history not forgotten but no longer defining, its present not perfect but reassuring in its calm. In villages nestled among the hills, bells still tolled the hour. Trains still passed quietly through mountain tunnels. Children still learned Mozart and Haydn in school. And the cafes, as ever, remained open, their tables full of quiet conversation, of newspapers folded neatly, of small routines gently observed. Life, as it had so often been in Austria, continued, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. A republic not of grand declarations, but of steady human rhythms. As the 21st century opened over Austria's rooftops and alpine ridgelines, the country entered an era marked less by dramatic change than by quiet reflection. A time not of empires rising or republics collapsing, but of continuity, re-evaluation, and the slow, methodical reshaping of national identity. A nation once defined by what it was part of, Habsburg, Reich, neutral Europe, now faced the subtler task of defining itself by what it had become. Austria remained a parliamentary democracy, its institutions well practiced, its political culture steady, though not without tension. Elections passed with little spectacle. Coalitions were formed with pragmatic deliberation, and the state functioned, as it had for decades, through the same cautious balance between change and tradition. The larger political parties still loomed large. The centre-right OVP, the centre-left SPÖ, but smaller voices, especially the Greens and various populist factions, began to gain ground, bringing with them questions of climate, migration, and memory. Memory, in particular, came to occupy an increasingly central place in Austrian public life. Not the grand, sweeping memory of empires, but the more personal, difficult, and necessary remembering of the 20th century's darkest chapters. In schools, curricula expanded to include franker discussions of the Anschluss, of Austrian participation in Nazi crimes, and of the Holocaust. Teachers guided students through the streets of Vienna, pointing out the Stolperstein, small brass plaques embedded in pavements marking the former homes of Jewish citizens deported and murdered. Museums and memorials multiplied, each offering a quiet space for reflection. The Judenplatz Holocaust Memorial, stark and solid, sat not far from the Baroque elegance of central Vienna, its silence a deliberate counterpoint to the city's usual charm. In Mauthausen, the former concentration camp became a site of education and commemoration, its grey stones and echoing spaces reminding visitors that history lives not only in archives, but in place, in presence. This growing engagement with the past did not happen all at once, nor without resistance. but it marked a turning, a willingness to accept complexity, to move beyond the comforting myth of Austria as Hitler's first victim, and towards a more nuanced understanding, one in which victimhood and complicity could coexist, and in which national pride did not require forgetting, but rather the courage to remember fully. Culturally, Austria continued to punch above its size. Its musical institutions, long the pride of the nation, remained central to its identity. The Vienna Philharmonic, the Salzburg Festival, and countless chamber groups and choirs maintained traditions that stretched back centuries. Yet alongside these stood new voices. Contemporary composers, filmmakers, novelists, and artists who challenged nostalgia with invention, and who helped Austria express not only its history but its present, its contradictions and questions, its humor and grace. In the realm of architecture and urban life, Vienna in particular became a model for others. Its careful blend of heritage and functionality, of public housing and green space, earned it repeated accolades as one of the world's most livable cities. The old and new coexisted gently. Baroque facades beside minimalist flats, horse-drawn carriages sharing lanes with trams. The city hummed not with excitement but with a quiet, civilized rhythm, as though still playing the slow movements of a Haydn quartet, softly, attentively. Austria's neutrality remained intact, though its meaning evolved. Membership in the European Union brought deeper integration, shared policies, and a more active role in international affairs. Yet the country maintained a careful distance from military alliances. It participated in peacekeeping missions, supported diplomacy, hosted talks, but always with a certain caution. A memory, perhaps, of how entanglements had once led to catastrophe. Neutrality, in the Austrian sense, was not isolation. It was a quiet vigilance, a respect for the costs of conflict, and a preference for the gentle rhythms of diplomacy. Demographically, Austria, like much of Europe, faced the subtle transformations of migration, aging, and urbanization. New communities arrived from Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East, some seeking work, others fleeing war, and while integration was not without challenge, the process unfolded with familiar Austrian method, slowly, bureaucratically, and with a certain politeness. In many schools, children now learned German alongside another mother tongue. Mosques stood quietly in suburbs, kebab shops nestled between apothecaries and bakeries. Identity became layered, lived rather than declared. These changes, like all changes, stirred debate. Some Austrians, particularly in rural areas, feared the erosion of tradition. Political voices rose to express concern, sometimes in harsh terms. Yet the country, by and large, avoided the sharp polarization seen elsewhere. Consensus, even when fragile, remained a defining trait, and the rhythm of life continued. The same morning trams, the same snowy peaks, the same careful rituals of state and season. In international crises, whether the refugee influx of 2015, the pandemic of 2020, or the shifting tensions within Europe, Austria responded with its characteristic blend of concern and procedure. Never at the forefront, rarely indifferent, acting not in haste, but with deliberation. A country that does not raise its voice unless necessary, but listens carefully all the while. As the 21st century deepened, Austria's sense of itself matured, no longer defined by empire or annexation, no longer retreating into victimhood or nostalgia. It had become something quieter, more grounded, a republic with memory, not seeking greatness but continuity, not perfection but participation, in shared European projects, in regional stability, in the everyday dignity of peaceful self-governance. The past remained close, of course. It lingered in the stones of the Hofburg, in the quiet pews of rural chapels, in the yellowing pages of letters kept in drawers. But it no longer weighed so heavily. It could be acknowledged without paralysis, spoken of without shame. And in that quiet reckoning, Austria found its modern form, not as a footnote to larger histories, but as a place in its own right, small, thoughtful, steady. And so the journey ends, not with triumph nor tragedy, but with a gentle persistence, from the prehistoric carvings of Willendorf to the quiet diplomacy of the 21st century. Austria's story has been one of continuity more than conquest, of survival through accommodation, of identity shaped not by singular events, but by the layered accretions of time. And in this gentle unfolding, there is something deeply human, something quietly enduring.